Hello, everyone. My name's Dr. Martin Westgate. I'm the leader of the Science and Decision Support Team here at the Atlas of Living Australia. And welcome to our first webinar for 2025, How Time Flies. Before we begin today, I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm presenting this webinar from Canberra, which is Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to extend those respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the call today. So today's webinar is quite special for us here at ALA, actually. If any one of them could be more special than the others, I suppose. They're all often quite fun. But look, we're Australia's biodiversity database, and we're used by a lot of people, government, industry. We have a lot of people who are just curiosity-driven who visit the ALA and just want to know more about the biodiversity in their country, in their town, in their neighbourhood. But today, we're here to hear from a group of people who use ALA for industrial applications. So how that is gaining biodiversity data or information and using it to guide business or government decisions, which is a really fascinating space and a really important one for Australia. So I'm really thrilled to be able to introduce our speakers today, who are Juliet Sears, who's here from the ALA. Give us a wave, Juliet. We've got Ali Cotton, who's here from APEM Group, and Elizabeth Stark, who's here from Symbolics. So great range of speakers. I'm going to get out the way and hand over to Juliet, who's our first speaker for today. And for those watching along at home, feel free to queue up your questions. We've got plenty of time for discussion at the end, and we're always interested to hear what comments or questions you've got for our speakers. Juliet, over to you.
Thanks, Martin. I'll just share my screen. Hang on. I think that, okay.
That's great.
Just 1 second. Okay, yes, I'm Juliet. As Martin said, I work for the ALA. I'm the training and outreach coordinator. Today, I'm going to give a bit of context just to start the webinar on a journey we've had at the ALA over the past few years, engaging a bit more with the industry sector. I'll give a brief recap on the background of this, what we've been doing, and some ideas for what we're thinking of doing next. So not long ago, a colleague of mine, he did a review of industry use of the ALA. The aim was to identify usage patterns, pain points, and opportunities for better engagement with industry. And one of the key findings in this research was there was an interest in training within the sector to ensure that individuals are using the ALA in the most efficient way possible and interpreting data, particularly those that contain sensitive species, to a high level of accuracy. Engaging with industry is important for us because it helps us to tailor our services to meet the needs of sectors that influence decision-making and impact our environment. So the ALA is used widely by industry for things like environmental assessments, regulatory compliance, and decision-making in areas like natural resources, energy, and infrastructure. And there's also a growing push for more collaboration between research infrastructures like the ALA and industry, mostly because this collaboration can drive innovation by sharing diverse ideas, and it can lead to better outcomes by applying research findings in those more practical settings and ways. And the 2021 Research Infrastructure Roadmap as well highlights the importance of efficient information sharing and decision making. It advocates for making data platforms like the ALA more accessible and user-friendly to support industry needs. So we saw this as an opportunity to enhance our impact by engaging more with this important sector. The review helped us to better understand industry usage patterns. We'd learnt that at the time, 150 businesses roughly were using the ALA every year. These users came from quite a range of contexts, including energy infrastructure and natural resource management. 63% of that group are repeat users, so that was quite promising. Indicates there's a general perception of reliability and trust placed in the ALA for our data and these crucial sectors. Most of them were searching the ALA as an initial research exercise for areas of potential development or protection. So they're looking for threatened species in these defined areas. The exact location of sensitive species like these is obfuscated on the ALA and is only made available through our restricted access species data service. But using the ALA helps these groups to at least have an initial insight into what might be in an area before they proceed with more detailed survey efforts. And based on the learnings of that report and consultation, we had several recommendations. And some of the more immediate ones we've been working on include developing industry-specific resources and a dedicated page on the ALA, which is happening a bit in the background as part of our user experience program, and implementing a communication strategy for industry and business. So the landing page will provide easy access to help documentation and tutorials that are relevant to industry, such as information on sensitive species data, area searches and integrations with other platforms used in the sector like GIS. We found that industry users were receiving our communications, but they weren't necessarily engaging with them because they found them to be a bit broad, and they're quite a time-restricted sector. So more effective methods of communicating with this audience was needed so we can get the right information to them. And there was also a high level of interest in online training sorry, for professionals to learn how to use the ALA more effectively. We decided to initially focus on the consulting sector because this is where time for professional development is often limited. So there was a greater need maybe to engage that audience. So to address some of those key challenges we faced, which was first, people weren't necessarily engaging with our communications, and even when resources could benefit them, they didn't always have time to go through them. We decided to reframe our approach. So instead of trying to get industry users to engage more with us and come to our content, we decided to reframe it and ask, how can we bring this information to them in the spaces that they're already occupying and the networks that they're already working within. So we identified some different key groups that represent the environmental sector, and we engaged with them collectively. And through this process, we connected with the Environment Institute of Australia and New Zealand, or EIANZ. EIANZ already has well-established communication channels with many of the stakeholders we wanted to reach, and they also have the capability to run online events which align perfectly with our goals. Even better, they oversee Australia's Environmental Practitioner Certification Scheme, which is a recognised credential that provides, it requires ongoing professional development. So by collaborating with EIANZ, we provided industry professionals with more of an incentive to participate in those events because they could count that attendance then towards a certification. And this approach turned what was previously a challenge into quite an opportunity for greater engagement and impact. So I mentioned there was demand for online training in how to effectively use the ALA. So that's what we did. And after engaging with EIANZ, we started offering training targeted on the topics that aligned with the most prominent use cases and workflows of our industry users, such as querying threatened species. This ensured we minimised the amount of interesting but not directly applicable learnings and ensured we provide the most value we could in a short span of time, which meant what was learned could then hopefully be immediately applied into the workflows of those that came to our training sessions. And offering these sessions online, usually during lunchtime, suited the schedules of most of these stakeholders and maximised attendance. We started running these sessions and working on our industry engagement about 18 months ago. And now we've engaged over 500 people, which is really promising. 90% of them are from our target sector, and the other 10% are mostly from federal, state and local government. and we've engaged with almost 250 different organisations, which, if you remember in my earlier slide, when we did the review, there were 150 organisations noted as using that ALA. So to have now reached almost 250 means we've definitely made progress towards engaging more with that sector. So to finish up, what's next? We're currently planning to schedule some new sessions, our first for 2025, so keep an eye out for those. And we're also going to expand the range of topics we offer training on now that we've been able to obtain some more feedback from attendees on what they'd like more of a deep dive on. We also have some other less concrete plans maybe to offer self-paced online training in the future, but that's quite early days, so you'll have to wait a bit to hear more about that. And that's all I've got, Martin.
Awesome. Thanks, Juliet. No, it's great to see that. It's funny, even things that I already know about. It's nice to see presented and laid out. So it's very cool. Ali, I believe you're up next.
Yes, hello. Let me just share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Over to you.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for having me, for the ALA for inviting me, and I hope everyone's having a great day. My name's Ali Cotton, and I'm looking forward to speaking to you today on this webinar about how biodiversity data can support Australian industry. So I'm based in Perth on the West Coast, and I'm an Associate Director for our Global Wildlife Surveys here at APEM, although I focus primarily on Australia and the wider APAC region. So I've been in academia and industry around 15 years across Australia, New Zealand, where I'm from, and the UK, working on a range of biodiversity data. But one area where this information is so essential is the offshore wind industry, a developing industry in Australia with a lot of data gaps to fill. I will talk to you briefly today about a key method that we use for data collection for birds and marine megafauna, which is the use of digital aerial surveys. The information our team collects then feeds directly into the wider EIA process, including in collision risk models and baseline technical reports. The type of data we collect also works throughout the lifetime of a wind farm, from baseline studies through construction and then into post-construction, in order for us to understand the impacts of these developments on key species and also provide insight into any potential mitigation that might be implemented. So just very briefly, a little bit about APEM Group. We're a global environmental consultancy, a growing one with a lot of great scientists and a lot of experience across a range of environmental methods and different industries. With our digital aerial surveys, we have decades of experience globally, and we're bringing that experience to Australia while building a strong local presence. So that now includes our APEM Australia team, as well as both Biosis and Atexo, who joined our group last year. So I just wanted to give a little bit of background as to how we began doing digital aerial surveys for the offshore wind industry. So traditionally, surveys were carried out using boats, visual boat surveys, and I want to stress that there's still very much a need for this in Australia. We use boat surveys to support our digital aerial surveys, as they provide a lot of useful data on species identification from below. But as a sole technique, however, it was found that there were some significant disadvantages, primarily due to the kind of subjective and immediate nature of the work in terms of having people on the boats and just making decisions as they go, and the fact that boats can act both as a repellent and an attractant of particular species. So the objective nature wasn't quite there in some cases. They then moved on to using planes, but more having people in planes doing visual aerial surveys to try and reduce that bias that they found with the boats. But there is a risk of disturbance due to the altitude the planes need to fly, which is very low in order for people to be able to see what they're looking at, especially for the birds. And again, you were kind of subject to quite limited quality assurance because you're making decisions, people are making decisions live as they go about species ID and things like that. So digital aerial surveys were subsequently developed to mitigate some of these key issues. So we have a series of cameras attached to the belly of the aircraft, taking thousands of pictures often, recording everything that is captured as they fly along transects. We fly at 13 to 1400 feet to avoid that disturbance that I spoke about earlier. And the recorded imagery allows us to have something that is kind of objective, that we can share, we can discuss, we can, look over all the identifying features of the individuals that we find, and it can obviously be stored for the future and re-looked at. So it's just kind of an objective record that can be stored, which is great. But then moving on, one of the kind of key attributes needed for understanding the impact of wind farms on flying birds in particular is accurate flight heights for species using the area, especially in data poor areas. So in order to get accurate flight heights, APEM developed the use of LiDAR technology to accurately measure flight heights. And this is now an integrated technology with our digital aerial surveys. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. So in terms of the importance of DAS, probably the abbreviation of DAS is digital aerial surveys. So the key aim for DAS is to provide data that enhances our understanding of natural species distribution, abundances and densities, and how that changes across the life cycle of a wind farm project. So our cameras provide a resolution of 1.5 centimeters GST, which is the distance between center points of adjacent pixels on the sea surface. And this resolution has allowed us to achieve best possible detection of key features used in identification of marine megafauna and birds. We have cameras pointing directly down, which allows us to capture marine megafauna even if they are mostly submerged. So that's been a really good element of the technique. APEM also have a GNSS and IMU, which is a global navigation satellite system and an inertia measurement unit inside the plane. And that allows us to capture the exact altitude, roll, pitch, and yaw, which you can see in the top right-hand corner there. So that's basically exactly the position of the aircraft at all times. So every time a picture is taken, we know exactly where that plane is. And that's really important for us because it allows us to capture really accurate effort data and georeference the location of every single individual that we see accurately. But no survey method works in isolation to provide all the data that's needed. Certainly not here to tell you that. And in Australia in particular, we use boat-based surveys to help us apportion those that aren't able to be identified to species level, where we're only able to identify individuals to a group level, for example. So lots of kind of multiple techniques here that are used. So in relation to survey methodology, we always design the survey bespoke to the project or the question being asked. There's no one size fits all at all for our surveys. But to provide a little bit of an overview, we generally have two main methods of data collection. We've got transect and grid-based surveys. So in transects, we collect continuous imagery along a predefined transect in much the same way as boat surveys do. It's a very useful technique for particularly regional large-scale surveys, which I'll touch on later, as it's time and cost-effective for low coverage needs. But for site-specific data, it's not the most robust method, as it can miss a flocking species, as you can see in the top right-hand there, because you tend to have larger distances between the transects. And because you're using transect number as your sample size, it limits statistical power. So grid-based surveys have a more even coverage of the area. And although the planes still fly and collect transect data as they do in the first method, only a certain percentage is analysed, and that allows us to capture flocking species and is more robust to any changes in the environment, as well as increasing the sample number relative to transects. So we would generally recommend a grid-based survey design whenever we're doing site-specific data. So just very briefly, as I mentioned, flight heights are a critical part of the data that's collected. Historically, or if we only are using DAS itself, they are calculated or modelled based on a series of factors such as the plane altitude, the reference lengths of the birds. And although that can give us an indication of flight heights, they tend to have quite high confidence intervals around them and therefore some uncertainty. But by flying a combined DAS and LiDAR system, we're able to get a measured and specific flight height, which feeds into the collision risk models and other EA reports and really reduces that uncertainty around that reporting. So it can be a really useful technique. I don't want to go too much into the tech because it's probably a bit too much detail, but I just wanted to give a little bit of a brief overview of how LiDAR works. So it essentially works by firing laser pulses down from the aircraft, and it calculates the height of the object that the pulses hit based on how long it takes for the return of that laser back up to the sensor. So the further away the bird or the object, the longer it takes for the pulse to return to the sensor. So we're able to identify what the returns are by simultaneously capturing the digital stills imagery and matching it to the point cloud return so that the DAS and LiDAR are integrated together in the plane. As you can see, the kind of as the bird flies through, it gets hit with the pulses, bounce off it and back up into the sensor. And with even the smaller birds, we tend to get 2 to 3 LiDAR hits per bird. And if you've got a large bird, then, for example, this gannet, then obviously you get more returns ascribed to them. And each point has a highly accurate XYZ location, and flight heights are generally accurate to within between 5 and 15 centimeters. So you're talking a much more accurate flight height for this method. I just wanted to give a few very quick examples. We worked with Was Marine Scotland, now the Marine Directorate, to survey an operational wind farm in Scotland, as well as a control area with no turbines, using the DAS and LiDAR system. We recorded around 1,000 flying birds, mostly gannets, kittiwakes, fulmar and large gulls. And we produced accurate flight heights, as well as some quite cool 2D and 3D models. And there's a few kind of bits of information you can see on flight heights and the models on the right-hand side, which is always a really cool thing to get out. So just very briefly, a little bit about some of the results that we found. On the right, we can see that we found many bird species were adjusting their height that they flew depending on whether the turbines were present or not, particularly fulmars, gannets and kittiwakes. They're all generally flying below the rotor sweep zone where turbines are present, whereas they had a much wider flying range of flight heights in the control area. And, you know, that obviously fits in with potential avoidance or displacement or avoidance behavior of the turbines. The LiDAR allows kind of these accurate comparisons to be made where size-based flight heights would have a much larger confidence interval. So you'd have much more uncertainty around the data of this type. For the large gulls, we didn't see any difference, but the sample sizes were quite small. So I think some more work would be really interesting on that to see if that's a true effect or not. In terms of Australian work to date, we've been using these methods to support the beginnings of the offshore wind industry, in Gippsland in particular, with site-specific environmental surveys. So for the, we did 2 years of surveys for the first 2 projects, Star of the South and Great Eastern Offshore. And we conducted the first year of surveys being DAS only, and the second year being DAS and LiDAR, which allows us to collect those flight heights. The site areas have a 4-kilometre buffer to investigate any potential displacement or avoidance behaviour throughout as we move through surveys throughout the lifetime of the projects. And the wind farms are constructed, the surveys, utilised a grid-based design with 20% collected coverage and 10% analysed coverage like we spoke about before. And I just wanted to finish on a note about, I guess, the importance of other data. So the work we tend to do is site-specific work for developers to understand potential wind farms and the species that are found there. However, from a scientific standpoint, there are key questions that remain important to answer, particularly how we can interpret the importance of a site without understanding the wider region, and how we can make judgments about impacts if we don't understand wider impacts or the cumulative impacts of multi-developments on a particular region. And we feel that this is really important data, that we still, a lot of work still needs to be done on to determine kind of regional species distribution and abundance across all of the potential feasibility sites in Australia. It allows us to determine things like hotspots of areas. It provides transparency to the general public because the data tends to be more widely usable, and it reduces uncertainty in each of the developers' EIAs if they have this regional data and they have more context for their site. So it's something that we're really interested in kind of pursuing further across the areas and discussing with more stakeholders as we go. Great. So on that note, I just wanted to say a massive thank you to the ALA for inviting me to speak, and for all of you for coming along and listening. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to drop me an email, or you can find me on LinkedIn, and yeah, happy to have any discussion if anyone wants to have. Thank you.
Thanks, Ali. That was fantastic. I have so many questions because I think that's really fascinating, some of the things you did there. But I'll hold them for the end. I will encourage anyone watching along at home to also queue up your questions now if you'd like. We'll have plenty of time for chatting later on. Right now, though, I might pass over to Elizabeth, if that's all right.
Yeah, cool. Let me do the share screen thing. Hopefully you're seeing a puppy dog. And
I am.
Great.
Looks great.
It's always how we double check because everyone wants to see the puppy dog. Yeah, hi, I'm Elizabeth. I've been involved, or I've been co-founder of a company called Symbolics that's been around for 20 years in Australia, and in that time we've specialised in data analysis and data science services for ecological monitoring and environmental monitoring, and also for livable cities type stuff. And so what I wanted to do today was not so much talk about a particular technology or model or case study, but actually having reflected on, like, I've been working as a systems designer basically for 20 years, and my job is to stand between industry and the stats guys in the office and the developers and the regulators, and kind of try and figure out what the solutions are and how to communicate that through. So with that in mind, what I thought might be good today is sort of to just do a quick high level, bit of a light lunchtime, 5 things you should know about plant and animal data before you start collecting it, or before you start engaging consultants to collect it. And so this is sort of high level stuff. Some of this might be familiar and some of it might not. One of the saddest conversations I always have to have with people is that the biggest data set doesn't always win. So if you imagine, we work with clients that are, say, doing feral animal management, say with cats and foxes. So you might be deciding between setting up a bunch of camera traps in a region or doing GPS monitoring. And on the surface, if we put our camera traps for a bunch of nights, we might get maybe 100 detections over our study period, compared to millions of pings from a GPS data. But the truth of the matter is that as much as we want to know, GPS tags will tell us an awful lot about this cat or this animal, but it won't necessarily tell us about the population. So one of the kind of mind shifts that has to come is that we're not trying to actually sample animals here. We're trying to sample your site, your wind farm, your area, and we're trying to understand what that population is doing within it. And to do that, yes, we have to, as Ali said, we have to combine more and more. We have to combine technology and humans in different ways, but we really have to be aware that targeted samples are amazing for certain things, but the biggest data set doesn't always win. It's also keeping that in mind, the fact that we're actually sampling from our particular areas. We need to actually try and understand how we do that in order to understand populations. And that's particularly relevant if you've, say, got migratory populations. So if I think of a site here, it might be a terrestrial wind farm, it might be a forestry site that's clearing land, and we want to understand, say, the patterns of a wedge-tailed eagle pair that's on the site. They're going to be there all year. I can go out a few times and sample, and I'm going to get what they look like. In that case, what I might be wanting to do is actually really dig down into the spatial patterns so I can understand which bits of the site that they're using. On the other hand, if I've got some migratory swift that's not there at all and is there like in the thousands for a week a year, how do I sample that? You know, I don't want to just go out in the week that swift is there, because I'm going to get a really, really negative picture of actually what's happening on that site. But I want to understand those temporal patterns. And so using sites like ALA to understand what's it's in the area beforehand, and actually modelling how you're going to detect those different things is really important. And also, not all metrics are created equal, and what you're measuring, it really has to be decided in terms of what you're going to analyse. So something will often be asked is, you know, given an ecosystem like a seagrass meadow and some kind of impact, dredging, fishing, whatever, what's the impact? How do I know after X amount of time if this is still healthy? And there are a lot of ways that we can dig into that question, and they're not all created equal. Thanks, I stole this picture off the web. Actually, here's one someone else prepared earlier. But there's lots of different ways that we might describe that, and different things might be surveyed differently. And also certain things may be not able to actually be surveyed. It may not matter how often we go out there, we're never going to have power to detect it. To think about other things, and often what we'll do is what we call a stream of evidence, streams of evidence type assessment, where we'll look at different aspects of a system to try and understand its health. And here I wouldn't be a true data science if I didn't talk about metadata. The data about your data matters. I really care about the animals. You know, I really care about the birds. But I also really care about the observers and what the observers are doing. So, you know, this poor little fella here, he's looking worried up in the sky trying to measure this bird. And actually something to note here is there are regulations in Australia by which, you know, we have to make certain data public. So we have to, if you see certain species in an area, they have to be recorded in various government lists. But often that's only presence data. And you think about it, if you tell me you've stood out in the field and you've seen 3 movements of this little green bird, it doesn't actually tell me anything about the risk. We really need to know, what survey did we see it? How long did you survey for? How far away was it? Which actually tells me how much of the site you could see. And here, not, you know, it might be an observer, it might be a camera. Like Ali said, all that stuff about knowing where the camera is, it's really important. That's golden when it comes to actually interpreting that data. All of that boils down to a really badly mangled analogy. You know, an hour around the table is worth 2 in the bush, or 6 in the bush, or 17 in the bush. Really, up until when I say that we need to have a statistician or a design person around the table before you go out there, that's not just a sales pitch. It's actually really important. But one thing that also is important is that, you know, with enough time and resources, I can dig into most patterns on site. So I can tell you the, you know, quote unquote likelihood of an impact, whatever that is for your site. What I can't necessarily tell you is the consequence of that impact. And again, Ali and I didn't like swap notes before this, but what the point that she was making about regional context, it really matters. Brush-tailed possums, they're really, really cool. But if you tell me that you're impacting 100 individual brush-tailed possums, that's a very different thing than if you're impacting 100 leadbeater possums that are critically endangered and they only exist in a small part of Victoria and then under a whole lot of other pressures. This bit here is actually part of, especially if you're talking about impact assessment type work or management, we want to know if there's been an impact and how bad that impact is. Well, that's likelihood, but it's also consequence. And often population, regional distribution, is your site high or low in comparison to the areas around it? That stuff that's often really, really, really difficult to dig into. And the part of the way, and it's not led by government a lot of the time in this country. So there's really a requirement for industry to be feeding back data within your company, between companies and industries, and back into the public to share in some way. So part of the time when you're thinking about doing your impact assessment, sure, there's stuff that you can't share for commercial reasons, but what can be shared, what results can be shared, what information about their population can be shared, and how can the metadata around it be shared so that it can be used for analysis. And so I'm going to actually plug Atlas of Living Australia, not because they're hosting it, but they know a lot about how to do this stuff safely. There are ways and means to do it safely, and contributing to that actually feeds back into our ability to actually talk about whether or not we've had an impact, both for regulatory purposes and also just for good social license. So yeah, that's my little pitch, a very brief spin through things I've been thinking about for the last 20 years, proudly supported by George the Kelpie and Chibi the collie dog, of course. Thank you very much.
That's awesome. Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, it's funny, actually, none of us compared notes before this meeting. I've been frantically writing down some of the things you said. So look, we've got a good 20 minutes or so now. Thanks for everyone who's been contributing questions in the chat. I'll try and get through those of them that I can. I guess I'll start with you, Liz, if that's okay, just because you're our last speaker. Look, you mentioned about a leader sharing, and I think philosophically, and particularly these days, there's a great desire to share it. Do you feel that there's but we talked to Juliet's talk, for example, picked up that a lot of people are busy, and I think that's a disincentive. Do you think there's other disincentives to get in the way of people wanting or being able to share data?
Yes, I mean, I think, just simple busyness is really a big deal. Also, partly it's sharing. Even when I work with industry, a big company might have a bunch of different sites, and if they may have different consultants that are sort of collecting similar things on the different sites, but then the data feeds back to them in all sorts of different formats, and all sorts of different, so one of the things that we work with clients, a big ask can just be developing some templates. That if you've thought about what you want to do, even across in your own business, about what you want to use this data for and how you want to combine it, what are the templates that you might use that you want data back in? And then once you've sort of got that data, then it's much easier to share it with, ALA and those kind of things. So things like templating data, actually, being very clear on the objectives and what surveys will and won't do, all of that leads into actually getting data back in a format that's sort of share ready.
Oh, I see. And you're right, those formats aren't always clear or obvious or easy to use. Ali, does this resonate with you? I mean, you guys must be collecting huge amounts of data, but I'm sure that there's questions you guys would have about what to share and with whom.
Yes, definitely. Absolutely. So I obviously a lot of the data we collect, and at least initially, is confidential data that is owned by our clients. But for example, in the UK, we're a little bit further along in terms of that data collection, and often that will then go on a central system, the Marine Data Exchange, once that data is then publicly available. So we're always keen for as much publicly available data as possible to go through, and it's discussions that we do have with our clients quite often. But obviously, initially, often that data is kept confidential. But definitely, we, if at all possible, are very keen to make that available and in the right, like you say, correct format with good metadata that's available for the wider public. It's really important.
Yeah, no, I can see that there'd be a commercial sensitivity aspect, but presumably there's simply a time aspect as well. Presumably by the time you're able to share that, there's presumably it's a little older, it's in a different format, it's on an old hard drive or something. I imagine that would hit you sometimes.
Yeah, well, we store all of our data for quite a significant amount of time, and all of our clients also have that data. So it's something that we don't ever look to lose, so to speak. So we have long-term data storage for, it's a lot of data, a lot of big files, but the team is well set up for that. So yeah, absolutely, there's definitely a time aspect, but the data can still be very useful even after some time. And it just depends a little bit on the work that's going on in terms of the number of potential sites that are collecting data and how useful that is to share. We have had clients have abutting wind farms, for example, that can share data between each other, which is useful, but it's a discussion that we're continuously having.
I see. Julia, if I could bring you in on this, like, what's your feedback been? You've done a few of these sessions now with industry sectors. What are the challenges that they're facing that they're coming back to you with?
I think a lot of I think we've covered it here. I think a lot of groups are wanting to share data, which is really promising. And they're required to with groups like in West Australia, they have IPSA, and to an extent in Victoria for permits, you have to share it with the State Atlas. But they do come in lots of different formats. So that means that I've had groups say, you know, well, we already shared, like we do share it. Why can't it just come from there into the ALA? It's like, well, it isn't in a templated format. So maybe that is an opportunity, something we could work on with these groups, putting together something that works for, hopefully it won't work for everyone. We can do our best, and then maybe more data could come through to the ALA from industry over time. Would be good.
Cool, thanks for that. I did have a very specific question for you, actually, which is someone asked if they could attend one of your webinars. Do you have a way that they could contact you?
Yeah,
Right.
sure. So they could email our support email, I'm sure, and we can keep them updated. But also we do always advertise them on our social media channels, and the Environment Institute does the same thing as well. And I think they have a mailing list just like we do too. So they'll send stuff out. It pops up on their events page. If you have a team though that's wanting to do something collectively, like reach out to us as well. Maybe we can arrange something specific for your group as well.
Awesome. No, thanks for that. I'm not even quite sure where to go next. There's so much that's interesting to be talked about. I guess some of the questions we've had though are about so Ali, you mentioned cumulative impact a bit and the context of the work that's going on there. Presumably that's a case then of trying to work out how important a particular place is relative to its surroundings. Does that add a lot of cost and complexity to your processes?
Yeah, I mean, I think the industry is definitely still developing and learning about where it needs to go in terms of data collection, and particularly cumulative impacts. But it does add, of course, it adds complexity, especially when you have multiple wind farms in quite a small condensed area, like obviously we see in the UK and here in Australia. So yes, it does. But there are, like we've, Elizabeth and I've spoken about, you can get that information. It just requires you to get that kind of regional scale context to really understand what's happening broadly, and then how those impacts might kind of be modeled moving forward. So yeah, it adds complexity, but it's not impossible. So we just need to make sure we're collecting the right data from the beginning, and that we have everything ready to go for when these wind farms are starting to be built.
No, I see. Liz, do you have a comment on that? I mean, you mentioned specifically about the a brush-tailed possum versus a leadbeater's possum and making those sorts of value judgments. It's not an easy thing to weigh these things against each other always, is it?
No, it's not. And partly that's when I retreat into saying I just do the numbers.
Good defense.
But yeah, no, it's really hard. And the population, no, I have nothing to add other than, yeah, it is really complex.
Just to follow on from that then, a set of questions we've had are about the fact that a lot of the things we study are ephemeral, and you mentioned the cat example there, or actually the swift one was a better one, right? Of saying that some things you only see it once. It might happen at night, it might happen somewhere you're not looking. Is there some way around that other than expert knowledge and just looking really hard? Oh, you have just muted though.
I just muted, yeah. Don't ask me that question, it's really hard. Yeah, there are ways and means to do it, and that's where, again, for things like migratory species that they're moving through a whole region, that's when if there is some kind of regional data or early warning system, that's really important. If you've got something that's really ephemeral, like some orchid that only pops up once every 10 years, if you've got a wetland, then yeah, we've done things like combined site surveys with historical record analysis, with landowner surveys. Hey, have you ever seen this here? Where might it occur? What, and sort of in that way, basically here are our questions and here is the transparent kind of process that we went through. And in terms of regulation, I guess I call it, it's qualitative but objective. If you can set up something that is like that and you actually lay out the process you went through to find that information and then the decision you made based on that, most of the time that's usually acceptable.
No, it is a challenge, isn't it? I did my PhD on frogs, and there were some that I saw once in years of surveys.
I will just add on to that. I think that there's different survey types or different survey methods will give you very different results in that sort of thing. Like if you're looking for particular key species, there's methods that will work very well for picking up very, critically endangered species, for example, that you really want to try and target. But if you're looking for a broad brushstroke approach to lots of different species to understanding distributions, then you'll use a different method. You just need to know what your question is in order to design your survey. There's no point saying, oh, we just did this one thing and that's just going to capture everything. It's just not possible. So I think if you know what your question is, you know exactly what you're trying to do, then there are methods for it. It's just being specific.
So it's interesting you say that, though. Something that was raised to me by your talk, Ali, was the use of technology, right, has transformed this space. Is it hard keeping up? I mean, when you're at the point of putting LiDAR on planes, you're at a slightly different scale from, I remember people doing pelagic surveys while I was a PhD student and just throwing up off the side of boats to try and track this stuff. It's a different world now, isn't it, in some ways? Yeah,
it is, but it's I mean, it's great to be, at the cutting edge, because it allows you to kind of, you've got to push the diet, you got to push the boat out, so to speak. So I think it's really important to do both, to stay grounded in what is actually working and what we know works, but also to kind of move the dial. Technology is moving very fast in a lot of different areas, and it's about the right technology for the kind of right questions that you're asking. But it's a really exciting time and a really exciting area to be able to kind of bring new technologies to the table and understand how they will actually help with data collection and help with that kind of that database of knowledge that we still have a lot to do. So I think it is really exciting.
No, absolutely, and actually something that I've learned just hosting these seminars is is some of the boundaries. We had one last year on camera traps that was similar, for example, with the Wild Ops team, who are doing incredible work. Frankly, it's hard to keep up with.
And the acoustic monitoring, we did a really cool project a few years ago on frogs with acoustic monitoring and, developing a little frog recognizer. Is it a frog? Is it not? Because, there's a whole lot of different ways to dig into how you survey something like that.
Yeah, I've still got some audio tapes sitting around from recorders from a few years ago. Maybe I should digitize those and see what's in them.
There's some really cool techniques now. But it's I think understanding that there isn't a silver bullet, that technology is amazing, and it allows us to do things we could never measure before. But there's still that you can answer. You can come up with a really beautiful answer for a question that doesn't matter for what you're trying to do, and that's really still the key.
No, I see that. I've probably been guilty of that myself. Juliet, we've talked then about about how quickly the sector's moving. Does that create challenges? You're a training officer and you're trying to train people who are at the cutting edge in some ways of this. Does that cause you problems?
I don't think it causes me personally problems. There's a lot more data out there now. There's camera trapping, as we said. There's eDNA. I think that's something that ALA is working on constantly, how we can accommodate a lot of these new data types. I mean, it's not a challenge, it's an opportunity for us, really. And I think, especially camera traps, there's just going to be more and more work in that space, particularly culling them down from that initial group.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've had a question about that in the chat, actually. Someone was asking whether we're going to have a chat bot for ALA, which is a great idea that I do not know how to code. So that will pass gently to the side for one of our tech team to come back to. But Ali, for example, you must be using image recognizers, presumably on your data set. So you presumably then you're running, your physical tech to actually detect all these things, and then you're running AI. Do you find it's that those have been beneficial, or is it hard to keep up sometimes?
I think a little bit like Liz was saying, it's about making sure that like the tech is it's great and it's there, and absolutely we are developing AI for for our internal processing, but sometimes there is no substitute for the skills of the people that we have in terms of identifying. So particularly birds can be quite cryptic, for example, and AI, just the ability to do that is tricky. So it's a balancing act between developing the technology, absolutely, and seeing where you can reduce kind of unnecessary processing time, for example. But also knowing that those skills built into people are absolutely critical and not something you can replicate easily. So it's definitely about making sure you've got the best quality data, no matter where that comes from, whether that's from technology or from manpower and from skill sets, and just kind of balancing those. So yeah, absolutely, lots of good technology. AI is going to be super important moving forward, and I'm sure it will change as we speak. But there is still a lot of incredible ornithologists and marine mammal experts there who have skills that you just cannot replicate through technology. So it's a bit of both.
Yeah, no, I could see that, and yeah, having worked with some very talented people in the field, I'd have trouble training a computer how to do that. What about you, Liz? Does this resonate with your experience? If you're having to advise people on how to design studies in a changing landscape, it must be tricky.
It's tricky, and one of the things is often the work is actually part of like a short-term project. Well, an impact assessment or something. You've actually got to get a license. So part of the challenge is actually that with technology, you're often, it's a bit of R&D involved, and it's very hard to manage that in a real short-term, got to get this report done by the 31st of March kind of thing. So she's working with a lot of people who are taking this. What I'm noticing is the industry is starting to have more conversations about researching technology and benchmarking it in Australia, and then opening that result up so that it can be used, which is really encouraging, because that's sort of what's got to happen. You've got to kind of do that R&D outside of you don't want $500 million of project kind of hanging off its success. But yeah, that's how you move it forward. So it's really exciting, but it's really challenging. And it's really heartbreaking when you tell someone that their millions of points of data it's not as good as they hoped, unfortunately. But we get more successes than not, which is good. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I imagine that would be a difficult conversation to have. But it's an interesting point that we started this by talking about sharing data, and the idea of sharing code or insights is another way that we can help each other out. And perhaps, Juliet, you said you'd worked with EIA-NZ. Presumably there's networks there that are good for sharing that sort of information as well.
Yeah, they have a number of what are they called? Like groups that focus on specific things. They have an ecology group and stuff, so they definitely have networks within their focus on that.
Wonderful. Okay, well, on that note, I'd like to thank everyone for their time. Thank everyone at home for tuning in and listening to us today. And yeah, join us again. Next one will be in 2 or 3 months. I'm not sure what our topic is yet. We'll look forward to announcing that in due course. And thank you to our speakers. Have a good day, everyone.